In November 1910, 6 of the richest men on Earth boarded a private train in New Jersey under the cover of darkness. They controlled 1/4 of the world's wealth, but that night, they were using fake names. They told the press they were going duck hunting. They were lying. They were traveling to a secret island off the coast of Georgia to do something illegal and revolutionary. They were going to invent the United States Federal Reserve. For 1 week, they erased themselves from history to write the rulebook for the modern economy. This is the story of how a secret meeting on a vacation island gave a small group of bankers control over the money in your pocket. This is the story of how money was made, and it reveals the invisible machine that runs the world. Chapter 1. The operation began on the night of November 22, 1910, at the Hoboken train station in New Jersey. The station was loud and crowded, filled with reporters and photographers. But attached to the end of the southbound train was a single, private rail car belonging to Senator Nelson Aldrich. The blinds were drawn tight. The door was locked. Inside that car sat a group of men who were never supposed to be in the same room. There was Paul Vorburg, a partner at Kuhnloeb & Co., representing the massive wealth of the Rothschilds in Europe. There was Frank Vanderlip, the president of the National City Bank of New York, representing the Rockefeller Empire. There was Henry Davison, the senior partner of J.P. Morgan. These men were business rivals. In public, they pretended to compete, but tonight, they were collaborators. The secrecy was absolute. They had been given strict orders by Senator Aldrich: avoid reporters at all costs. Do not dine together in the station. Arrive one by one. If the public found out that the Wall Street Titans were meeting with the most powerful politician in the Senate, it would have destroyed the stock market. The American public in 1910 hated bankers. They blamed them for the high prices and the lost jobs. If they knew these men were writing a banking law, they would have rioted. So, the billionaires played a game. They adopted code names. They instructed the train porters to address them only by their first names. Arthur, Paul, Nelson. They carried shotguns and hunting gear as props. They pretended to be a group of simple sportsmen heading south for the winter duck season. As the train pulled out of the station and disappeared into the night, the men relaxed. They lit cigars and opened the wine. They were safe. For the next 1,000 miles, they were ghosts. They were heading to the most exclusive, secluded place in America, private club on Jekyll Island, Georgia, where no reporter was allowed to set foot. The train stopped at the small station in Brunswick, Georgia, but the journey wasn't over. The group boarded a private boat to cross the water to Jekyll Island. As they approached the dock, they realized they were entering a fortress. In 1910, Jekyll Island was the most exclusive club in the world. It was owned by a small group of millionaires, including J.P. Morgan and William Rockefeller. It was described by a magazine at the time as the richest, the most exclusive, the most inaccessible club on Earth. It is estimated that the members of this one club controlled 1/6 of the entire world's wealth. But for this specific week, the club had been changed. The normal staff, the waiters, the maids, the cooks had been sent away. Senator Aldrich was terrified that a regular waiter might recognize the face of Paul Vorburg or Frank Vanderlip from the newspapers. If a servant gossiped, the secret would be out. So, they brought in a new staff from the north. These workers were told nothing. They didn't know who they were serving. They were simply told that a group of important gentlemen were coming to hunt ducks and play cards. When the group arrived at the main clubhouse, the building was silent. The other members had been told to stay away. The shutters were closed. The telephone lines were effectively cut off from the mainland. They were completely isolated. For the next 9 days, these 6 men lived together in total secrecy. They ate wild turkey and oysters. They smoked cigars by the fire, but they didn't hunt a single duck. They sat around a large table covered in papers, arguing about the future of money. They knew that if they failed, the American economy would continue to crash every few years. But if they succeeded, they would create a system that would give them power over every bank, every business, and every paycheck in the United States. The hunting trip was a cover. The real target was the US dollar. Chapter 2. The atmosphere inside the Jekyll Island clubhouse was not friendly. It was tense. The men sitting around the polished wooden table represented the biggest financial empires in the world: Morgan, Rockefeller, and the European banking families. They were used to giving orders, not compromising. The leader of the meeting was Senator Nelson Aldrich. He was a powerful, imposing man who is known as the general manager of the nation. He represented the political power, but the man who dominated the conversation was the outsider, Paul Vorburg. Vorburg was a German banker who had moved to America. He looked at the American financial system and thought it was a joke. He told the men in the room that the United States was financially primitive. In Europe, countries like England and Germany had central banks. These were massive, government-backed institutions that could control the money supply. If there was a panic, the central bank could print money to save the banks. In America, there was no safety net. If a bank ran out of money, it died. Vorburg argued that they needed to copy the European model. They needed a central bank of the United States. But Senator Aldrich slammed his fist on the table. He told Vorburg he was politically naive. The American public hated the idea of a central bank. They saw it as a tool of tyranny, a way for the rich to control the poor. If they tried to create a central bank, Congress would burn the bill before it even got to a vote. This was the core problem of the meeting. The bankers wanted the power of a central bank, the ability to control interest rates and print money, but they could unuse the name, so they decided to pull off a linguistic magic trick. They spent 9 days arguing over the wording. They decided they would not call it a bank. They would call it a reserve association. They would not say it was central. They would say it was regional. They would split the bank into 12 branches across the country to make it look decentralized and democratic. It was a brilliant disguise. The structure they designed looked like a government agency that protected the people. In reality, it was a private machine owned by the banks themselves, designed to lend money to Wall Street when the markets crashed. Paul Vorberg provided the complex math to make it work, but Senator Aldrich provided the political camouflage to hide it in plain sight. By the end of the 9th day, the table was covered in ash from cigars and drafts of the new law. The 6 men were exhausted, but they had done the impossible. They had written a complete blueprint for the American financial system. It was a masterpiece of deception. The plan proposed a system that appeared to be controlled by the government, but the board of directors would be selected by the private banks. It gave the banks the power to print money during a crisis, ensuring they would never go bankrupt again. They called it the Aldrich Plan. As they packed their bags to leave the island, the paranoia returned. They couldn't be seen leaving together. It would look too suspicious. They devised a staggered departure schedule. One man left on the morning boat, another took the afternoon train. They slipped away one by one, returning to their normal lives as competitors. When Senator Aldrich boarded the train back to Washington, he carried the only copy of the plan in his briefcase. He knew that the hardest part wasn't writing the law, it was selling it. He was about to walk into a political minefield. The American people were angry at Wall Street. If they found out that this reform bill was written by the very bankers they hated, they would destroy it. Aldrich knew he had to lie. He had to go back to the Senate and pretend that this idea came from him, a servant of the people, and not from a secret room full of billionaires on a private island. The meeting was over, but the con was just beginning. Chapter 3. To understand why these rivals agreed to meet on a secret island, you have to look at the terror they felt 3 years earlier. In October 1907, the American economy didn't just stumble, it fell off a cliff. It started on the streets of New York. A rumor spread that a major bank was out of money. Within hours, thousands of people were lining up around the block, banging on the heavy wooden doors, demanding their cash. But the cash wasn't there. In 1907, there was no safety net. When a bank ran out of bills, it closed. When it closed, businesses couldn't make payroll. Factories shut down. In a matter of days, the panic spread like a virus across the country. The stock market crashed. The U.S. Treasury was almost empty. The government in Washington was powerless to stop it. There was only one man in America strong enough to hold back the tide: J.P. Morgan. Morgan was 70 years old, a giant of a man with a fierce temper and a nose disfigured by a skin condition. He didn't hold public office, but he held the checkbook. As the country collapsed, he decided to act as a one-man government. He summoned the presidents of the biggest trust companies in New York to his private library on 36th Street. These were wealthy, powerful men, but in Morgan's presence, they were terrified. They arrived at night, entering the room filled with rare books and Renaissance art. Morgan told them they had to put up millions of dollars of their own money to save the weaker banks. They hesitated. They didn't want to risk their fortunes to save their competitors. So J.P. Morgan did something legendary. He walked out of the library, closed the massive steel doors behind him, and locked them from the outside. He literally took the New York banking elite hostage. He told them no one was leaving the room until they agreed to the bailout. The men sat there for hours, trapped in the library, arguing and sweating, while Morgan sat in the other room playing solitaire. Finally, at 4:45 in the morning, broken by exhaustion and Morgan's will, they surrendered. They signed the papers. Morgan unlocked the doors, shook their hands, and sent them home. The money was released, the banks opened, and the panic ended. J.P. Morgan had saved the country single-handedly. But the government in Washington looked at this event and realized something terrifying. The United States of America was relying on the health of one 70-year-old man. If Morgan died, the next panic would destroy them all. The panic of 1907 was over, but the fear didn't leave Wall Street. The bankers looked at the numbers and realized how close they had come to total extinction. They had been saved by J.P. Morgan, but Morgan was an old man. He couldn't live forever, and he couldn't stop the next crash from the grave. The titans of finance realized they had a structural problem. In the current system, when people got scared, they took their money out of the banks. The banks had no way to get more cash quickly, so they collapsed. It was a chaotic, natural cycle. The bankers didn't want chaos. They wanted order. They wanted a guarantee. They realized they needed to build a machine that could do exactly what J.P. Morgan had done: print money and loan it to banks in trouble. But they needed it to be permanent, automatic, and legal. They wanted a system where, if they made bad bets and the market crashed, a lender of last resort would be there to bail them out. But there was a catch. They couldn't just build a private fortress and tell the public, "Trust us." The American people didn't trust them. The public wanted the government to control the money, not Wall Street. This was the puzzle. How do you create a bank that is owned by private bankers, but looks like it is owned by the voters? How do you give Wall Street the keys to the printing press without starting a revolution? Senator Nelson Aldrich took this problem to Europe. He spent 2 years touring the great central banks of England, France, and Germany. He watched how they worked. He saw how the politicians and the bankers worked together to control the economy. He returned to the United States with a clear mission. He knew exactly what had to be done, but he couldn't write the law in the Capitol building where reporters were watching. He needed absolute secrecy. He needed the smartest financial minds in the room, and he needed them far away from Washington. That is why he sent the telegrams. That is why he booked the private train car. The Panic of 1907 proved they needed a king. The meeting at Jekyll Island was to build the throne. Senator Nelson Aldrich returned to Washington with a secret blueprint in his pocket, but he faced a massive problem. He was known as the Senator from Wall Street. His daughter had married John D. Rockefeller Jr. Everyone knew he was a friend of the banks. If he simply walked onto the Senate floor and introduced a bill called the Banker's Plan, the public would tear him apart. So, Aldrich and the bankers devised a strategy of pure deception. They decided to run a false flag operation. Aldrich launched a public tour across the western United States. He traveled from town to town, giving fiery speeches to farmers and small business owners. In these speeches, he railed against the corruption of Wall Street. He warned the crowds that the big banks in New York were dangerous and needed to be controlled. It was an Oscar-worthy performance. The man who had just spent a week drinking wine with J.P. Morgan's partners was now standing on podiums, pretending to be their enemy. He told the public that he was writing a bill to break the power of the money trust. Meanwhile, back in New York, the bankers played their part in the charade. They publicly criticized Aldrich. They gave interviews to newspapers saying that Senator Aldrich's ideas were dangerous and bad for business. They pretended to be terrified of his reform bill. It was a perfectly coordinated lie. The bankers knew that if they pretended to hate the bill, the American public would love it. They were using the public's anger against them. They were betting that the average voter wouldn't read the fine print. If they had, they would have seen that the bill didn't break the money trust. It legalized it. Aldrich wasn't building a cage for the bankers. He was building them a fortress, and he was asking the public to pay for the bricks. Despite the speeches and the secret planning, the Aldrich plan hit a wall. When Senator Aldrich finally introduced the bill to Congress in 1911, the deception didn't hold up. The Democrats in Congress were suspicious. They looked at the details and realized the Reserve Association looked suspiciously like a central bank run by Wall Street. They saw Aldrich's name on it, and because his reputation was so tied to the Rockefellers, they refused to vote for it. The bill died on the floor of the Senate. For the bankers, this was a catastrophe. They had exposed their hand and lost. But they were stubborn. They knew they couldn't pass the bill with a Republican like Aldrich attached to it. The Republican Party was seen as the party of big business, and the country was turning against them. So, the bankers gathered again, not on an island, but in the private clubs of New York. They realized they needed a new strategy. If they couldn't pass the bill through the Republican Party, they would have to hijack the Democratic Party. They needed a new face. They needed a candidate who looked like a reformer, someone who spoke like a professor and claimed to hate Wall Street. They needed someone the public would trust to clean up the banks, while secretly working with them to pass the Jekyll Island plan under a different name. They found their man in the governor of New Jersey, Woodrow Wilson. He was an academic, an outsider, and he spoke eloquently about protecting the common man. He was the perfect mask. The bankers decided to do the unthinkable. They would abandon their own political party and secretly fund the opposition. They were about to rig the 1912 election to ensure that no matter who won, the bank would win. The election of 1912 was a chaotic political war, but for the bankers, it was a calculated opportunity. They realized that their old ally, the Republican Party, was destroying itself. Former President Teddy Roosevelt had turned against his old friend, President William Howard Taft. They were splitting the Republican vote in half, attacking each other daily in the press. The bankers knew that with the Republicans fighting a civil war, the Democrat, Woodrow Wilson, was almost guaranteed to win. A normal businessman would have been terrified. Wilson was running on a platform of the new freedom. He promised to destroy the monopolies and break the grip of Wall Street. He shouted to cheering crowds that the banks were the enemy of the common man. But while Wilson was attacking Wall Street in public, his top advisors were taking secret meetings with them in private. The bridge between the two worlds was a man named Colonel Edward Mandell House. House was Wilson's closest advisor, a mysterious figure who held no official office but lived in the White House. House was also a quiet friend of the Jekyll Island group. He convinced Wilson that the Aldrich plan wasn't actually evil, it just had bad branding. Colonel House brokered a silent deal. The bankers agreed to drop the name Aldrich. They agreed to let the president appoint the board members, so it looked like the government was in charge. In exchange, Wilson agreed to support the central bank structure they had designed on the island. It was the ultimate Trojan horse maneuver. The bankers began to donate money to Wilson's campaign. They helped him win the White House, knowing that the man who promised to destroy them was actually the only man who could save them. When Wilson took the oath of office in 1913, the public cheered for a new era of freedom. The bankers cheered because their bill was finally heading to the president's desk. disguised as a weapon against themselves? With President Wilson in the White House, the bankers dusted off the secret plan from Jekyll Island and gave it a new name. They stripped the name Aldrich off the cover and renamed it the Federal Reserve Act. They marketed it not as a bank, but as a government solution to stop the banks from crashing the economy. But there was still a massive problem. The Democratic Congress was filled with people who hated Wall Street. If they suspected that J.P. Morgan or the Rockefellers supported this bill, they would vote no instantly. So, the bankers decided to use reverse psychology. They launched a coordinated public attack against their own bill. Frank Vanderlip and the other attendees of the secret meeting gave angry interviews to newspapers. They called the Federal Reserve Act socialist. They claimed it would destroy the American banking system. Senator Aldrich publicly declared that the bill was radical and revolutionary. It was a masterful performance. When the skeptical congressmen saw the big bankers screaming and crying about the bill, they became convinced it must be a good law. They thought, if Wall Street hates this, it must be good for the people. They didn't realize they were being played. The bankers were publicly attacking the law while secretly telling their paid politicians to support it. The deception worked perfectly. The opposition in Congress began to crumble, believing they were winning a victory against the rich. The bankers had successfully sold the trap to the mice. Now, they just needed to snap it shut before anyone read the fine print. The final battle for the Federal Reserve didn't take place in a crowded debate hall. It took place in a half-empty room during the holidays. By December 1913, Congress had been arguing for months. Everyone was exhausted. The opponents of the bill, mostly rural representatives who distrusted New York banks, were preparing to head home for Christmas. They assumed that no major legislation would be passed until everyone returned in January. But the supporters of the bill, working closely with the White House, had no intention of waiting. They saw the holiday season not as a break, but as a weapon. As the trains filled up with congressmen heading back to their families in the Midwest and South, the pro-bank faction stayed behind in Washington. They waited until the opposition had literally left the building. On December 22nd, the House passed the bill. On December 23rd, 2 days before Christmas, the Senate moved for a final vote. It was a political ambush. The critics who had fought so hard against the central bank were sitting in their living rooms hundreds of miles away, unaware that the vote was happening without them. The bill passed the Senate by a vote of 43 to 25. A massive change to the American economy was pushed through by a skeleton crew. 1 hour after the Senate vote, the bill was rushed to the White House. President Woodrow Wilson was waiting. He didn't wait for a ceremony. He didn't wait for the morning. He signed the Federal Reserve Act into law at 6 p.m. that same evening. He used 4 different gold pens to sign his name, handing them out as souvenirs to the men who had engineered the victory. The 6 men who had met on Jekyll Island 3 years earlier had won. They had successfully taken a plan written in secret by bankers, disguised it as a plan to control bankers, and passed it into law while the opposition was unwrapping Christmas presents. The United States now had a central bank, and the control of the nation's money had quietly shifted from the government to a board of directors that answered to Wall Street. When the American public woke up the morning after the vote, the newspapers hailed the Federal Reserve Act as a great victory for the common man. The headlines claimed that the money trust had been broken and that the government finally had control over the economy, but in the backrooms of Congress, the few opponents who had stayed behind were furious. Congressman Charles Lindbergh, Sr., the father of the famous aviator, stood on the floor of the House and delivered a chilling warning. He declared that the act had established the most gigantic trust on earth. He famously said, "When the president signs this act, the invisible government by the money power, proven to exist by the money trust investigation, will be legalized." Lindbergh pointed out the details that the public had missed. The Federal Reserve was not actually federal. It had no government funding. Its employees were not civil servants. It was a private corporation, and its stock was owned entirely by the member banks. The government could appoint the chairman, but the banks controlled the money. The deception was total. The law gave this private corporation the exclusive right to print the currency of the United States. It meant that every time the government needed money, it couldn't just print it. It had to borrow it from the Federal Reserve at interest. The debt clock had begun to tick. The men from Jekyll Island had built a machine that would ensure the government was permanently indebted to the banks. They had secured their own survival, but they had also handed the country a financial weapon that was about to be used in the biggest war human history had ever seen. The new financial machine opened for business in 1914. Less than 12 months later, the world exploded. World War I broke out in Europe, dragging empires into a conflict that cost millions of dollars a day. In the old system, a war of this size would have bankrupted the nations involved very quickly. There was only so much gold in the vaults. But the new Federal Reserve changed the rules of physics for money. England and France were desperate for supplies. They needed to buy food, ammunition, and steel from American factories. But they didn't have the cash to pay for it. They turned to Wall Street for loans. Before the Federal Reserve, American banks would have been terrified to lend billions of dollars to foreign countries fighting a war. If the war went badly, the banks would collapse. But now, they had a safety net. The Federal Reserve allowed the banks to expand their credit massively. JP Morgan and other banks organized loans of over $500 million to the Allies. The machine worked exactly as designed. It acted as a massive pump, moving money from the future debt into the present war production. American factories hummed. The bankers collected huge fees on the loans. The economy boomed. But there was a hidden cost. To fund this massive expansion, the supply of dollars had to increase. When you print more money without making more stuff, the money becomes worth less. Between 1913 and 1919, the purchasing power of the US dollar began to nosedive. The stability promised by the bankers was actually a slow, invisible tax called inflation. The people working in the factories saw their wages stay the same, but the cost of bread and rent started to climb. The bankers on Jekyll Island had successfully insulated themselves from the risk, passing the bill down to the public in the form of a dollar that bought a little less every single day. The true legacy of the meeting on Jekyll Island isn't written in a history book. It is written on the price tag of everything you buy. Before 1913, prices in America were remarkably stable. A loaf of bread cost roughly the same amount for 50 years. But after the Federal Reserve took control, the value of money began a one-way journey downward. Since the Federal Reserve Act was signed, the US dollar has lost over 96% of its purchasing power. A dollar from 1913 is worth less than 4 cents today. The machine created by the bankers worked perfectly to protect the banks from failure. But the cost was the slow, steady erosion of the public's savings. The men who met on the island Aldrich, were Berg Morgan's partners, didn't live to see the modern world. But their system did exactly what they designed it to do. It consolidated the banking power of the United States into a single, unchallengeable fortress. During the Great Depression, the 2008 financial crisis, and the 2020 pandemic, the Federal Reserve had the power to print trillions of dollars to save the financial system, while the value of the currency held by regular people quietly melted away. Today, Jekyll Island is a state park. You can visit the clubhouse. You can sit in the room where the 6 men sat. It feels like a museum, quiet and dusty. But the power that was born in that room is more alive than ever. The secrecy of 1910 has been replaced by the normalization of 2024. Most Americans assume the Federal Reserve is just a boring government office. They don't know about the private train car with the blinds drawn. They don't know about the fake names. They don't realize that the most powerful institution in the global economy was born not in a public debate, but in a conspiracy of rivals, who realized that the best way to win the game was to rewrite the rules while everyone else was sleeping.